Hey, what's up? I'm Jason, and today I want to talk about something important and I think a little bit funny. The more I think about it, the funnier I think it is, which is kind of weird, and especially when it comes to game development. So, think about when you start working at a new company. You start working at a game company or even a non-game company, or maybe I'd say this applies less if you open up just an open source project, but it may apply there too. But generally, when you start working at a game company, one of the first things that you'll get as a programmer is a link to some internal doc that has coding standards on it. And they'll say, hey, here's the coding standards, go check them out. And you may have seen these before. If you've worked at places that don't have these, then hey, hang on, because this is going to get even better. You've really been missing out. So the places with the coding standards docs, usually what happens is they send you a link, you get this email, they go, hey, did you go check it out? And you go, yeah, I went through and read, and it was a little bit of info about how to case things and maybe how to abbreviate things and what things should be named. A lot of the time, they're like a one-page doc, or sometimes it's a slightly longer doc, and you'll read it, understand it, and then you'll go look at the code and go, oh, wait, is this new? Like, is this a new coding standard doc that you guys just wrote up and we're working on switching over to that, or what's going on here? And you find out, oh no, that doc's been there since the start. Just nobody actually follows the damn thing, right? Everybody just does whatever they want. Everybody uses their own standards, and it's a big giant mess. And I think like, hey, why does that matter? Who cares? Like, whatever. Let me code the way I want to code, and let my buddy over there code the way he wants to code. The problem is that when people get into your code, it gets confusing as hell. So if one person's doing things one way, another person's doing things a completely different way, maybe one section of the code is all link statements, another section it's no link statements at all, and all this other stuff with weird abbreviations, and then another spot, you get the idea. Things can get messy really fast and really, really confusing. Coding standards are there for a reason. It's supposed to be an agreement that you make with your team. Everybody comes together and you say, hey, this is how we want it to look. This is what perfect code would look like. So let's make our code look like perfect code. For some reason, though, everybody will make those agreements and then just ignore them, or just say, hey, I'll fix it later, or yeah, they're not doing it there, so I won't do it here. And there are a couple reasons that this happens. Before I dive into the actual standards, which I'm going to do in just a moment, so if you're looking for those, you can skip ahead or just hold on. Also, if you want a whole doc of all these coding standards, leave a comment below. If there's enough of them, I'll put the doc together and then I'll put it in the description and you'll be able to go grab it. If there's no interest, then whatever. But if there's enough comments down there, I'll go do that right away. So anyway, why does this happen? Why do people ignore the coding standards? Why do people get all these cool rules for how to make perfect code and then say, hey, we don't care. We don't want the perfect code. What actually happens? Usually the scenario that I've seen is that the coding standards doc is put together in the wrong way. And it's not the formatting or the rules that are wrong. It's the process. What happens is one person, often the lead or the first person, will go in and write up this doc based on how they write their code. And then that becomes the rule. And everybody else goes, yeah, I see that, but I think it's a little bit wrong here, so I'm just going to ignore that part. And then the next person comes in and does the same thing, ignores two parts, and does things a little bit one way and a little bit the other guy's way, and then a little bit their own way. And it starts to get worse and worse. And then it kind of grows and becomes a mess. And suddenly your coding standards doc is just a useless lie, right? It's a piece of trash that nobody believes because nobody uses it. So what's the right process? For me, I think that the perfect process is one where you come together with your team. You get all of the programmers together and you say, hey, let's figure out what we want this to be. Let's figure out the rules for each of these different things. How do we want our code to look? What should it look like? How should things be named? All that kind of stuff. And you write those rules together. You agree on them live together in a call. Where you're talking, I would say even turn on video if you're remote, or be in the same room and just write it all down. Whatever you do, don't do asynchronous stuff. Try to get it as synchronous as possible. Yeah, so that you're working together and live. Now, before I dive into the details of each of these coding standards, I just wanted to briefly show an example of a coding standards doc that I just found by doing a quick Google search. So here you see he's got classes and interfaces, how to name them, what to do for methods, what to do for fields, parameters, names, how to set up his braces, and a couple other very small rules. Now let's dive into some coding standards that I actually use on my own projects. And we're going to do that by going through this weapon class file to start. And we're going to begin with casing, just like that document that we just looked at did, because I think it's an important part that sets a precedent through your entire code base. If your casing is wrong, everything else is probably a giant mess too. So let's start with the first rule of casing. on line 7 here, we've got our weapon class, and it is Pascal cased. So we have an uppercase W, and if you look at our mono behavior, Unity also follows this same rule. Capital M and a capital B. So we capitalize each word of our class names, and we always do that. Also, the file name always should match the class name, and it should match that same capitalization. So make sure that you're not breaking that rule. Now let's go on to line 9, constants and making them scream. If you look here, I'm in Writer, and Writer actually recommends that I change it. It says, hey, constant fields should be Pascal case. They shouldn't be this screaming all uppercase with an underscore. I personally disagree because I don't use constants very often, and when I do have them, I want it to be very obvious that it's a constant, because most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, if I see something Pascal case like that, I'm going to think property in my head. I'm going to think, okay, I'm just accessing a property, and I can probably do some other stuff with it. And a lot of the time, I don't want that. I don't want to be confused and think like, okay, is something changing this property? Is this property variable? Like, the biggest reason that I want to know that the thing is a constant is because it just locks it in my head. This is not going to change. I don't have to worry about it. So spelling it out that it is a constant with this all uppercase and underscore gives me a lot of value, and I still recommend it to everybody. And by the way, just for anybody who's not familiar with constants, the whole concept here is that this value here, my reload time, cannot change. This const keyword just makes it so that the value can't change at runtime. It gets compiled down, and essentially this reload time gets replaced with 0.3 everywhere in the code when the compiler runs. All right, let's go on to the next one. Line 11 here. We have our private int underscore ammo in clip. And this says underscore and camel case are private fields. This is also a point of contention a lot of the time. And the reason for that is that not the camel case. The camel case is very common for private fields, but there's always a lot of contention about whether or not to use an underscore. I have used an underscore for a lot of the time and then switched away from it and realized the pain of losing it and switched right back to it. So I generally always recommend putting an underscore before a private variable. Again, the biggest reason for this is immediate, instant knowledge of whether or not this is a parameter or a class-specific private or protected field. If it's got an underscore, I know it's definitely not a parameter. I can instantly just kind of get that extra context without thinking about it, and it doesn't add a lot of noise. I find that the underscore is the least intrusive way to do this. I've seen other people use things like m underscore, which was, I believe, meant to be member of the class, and the underscore, but I feel it adds a lot more noise. The underscore, because it's just a subtle little line, doesn't do much, but it gives you just enough context to know what it is. So an underscore and camel case for all private fields. And you'll notice as we go down to 13 and 14, I do the same for protected fields. And again, this is also a point of contention sometimes. Some people disagree, but I would recommend going with the underscore for your protected fields as well as your private ones. Public ones, no, but protected and private, definitely. And you see Writer, again, disagrees with me on protected fields. I still just find the value there in the underscore, knowing that it's a member of the class and not a parameter. That's where I really care about the differentiation. Next, I want to talk about public properties, or even private properties, all properties. And a property is just a field, or somewhat like a field, but with a getter or a getter and a setter. And here I've got it a little bit confusing. So let's convert our expression body property on line 16 over to a normal property where we have the getter. So say we've got a property like this where it has a get and it returns something. The proper casing here is Pascal case. And no matter what the property is, if you have a getter or you have a setter, Pascal casing is generally the way to go. Now, I want to dive into properties a little bit more, though, because we're already looking at one, and I want to point out that I generally would recommend using an expression body property when it applies. When it fits in a scenario like this, if you're just getting something and doing an evaluation, try replacing your get statement with just this little lambda operator, this equals greater than operator. What this is going to do is replace your getter with whatever this is. So the response for has ammo will just return back this whenever you call the get on it, which is essentially just saying, hey, if has ammo, which you can see on line 20. So expression body properties, highly recommended. Also expression body methods when there's only one action in there. If it fits on a line, convert it over and simplify things. But also, more importantly, Pascal case for properties. Always go with that, even if it's a private property that's just doing some calculation. I always go with Pascal case there. So what about methods? So I've got a fire at method on line 18. This would be a method for my weapon to fire at some target. But we have two naming conventions here. First, we have the name of the method, fire at, which would be in Pascal case. And then we have the parameters, like our target to damage. And these are always in camel case. So Pascal case for the method and camel case for the parameters. And if you look down at line 25, you'll see the last of them, which is camel case for local variables too. And this is really all of the rules that you have for casing. There's not a lot to it. It's just very important that you stick to it and keep it standardized. If you keep to these rules, it's very easy to know if something's private, if it's public, if it's a class, if it's a field that's improperly exposed, or something else. So stick to these good casing rules, and let's go on to the next one. Now I want to talk about one of the worst offenders, and this is the thing that I see happen all the time, and it drives me completely insane, and this is abbreviations. And as you can see here, I've abbreviated our weapon class to show just how beautiful it can look and how much harder we can make it to understand, just to save a little tiny bit of screen width here. So I've got my class renamed to WP because, hey, if you don't know it's a weapon, well, too bad, you're out of luck, right? And then I've got my reload time there as RLT, just in case you're wondering. And then AIC, which probably means something. Oh yeah, ammo in clip, right? So you get the idea. We can have abbreviations for things. We can shorten the crap out of these things and make the names confusing so that if you're right in the mindset of it and you remember exactly what it was and you just wrote the code, you know exactly what it is, and you saved yourself an extra 3 finger strokes. But the second you come back and read it or anybody else reads it, they get confused as hell. So do not abbreviate things almost ever. There are a few very small scenarios where I would say abbreviations are acceptable. Things like the word min and max instead of minimum and maximum, or where there's a domain-specific abbreviation that everybody working on the project is going to understand, or that it only makes sense for your project. Like if you're working on some HIPAA compliance, don't spell out the entire whatever HIPAA stands for, just write HIPAA, or whatever the thing is, the abbreviation that is common and makes sense for that context. But don't abbreviate your words and your variable names just to shorten them. In fact, always, I'd say, avoid abbreviating them, spell them out, and be very explicit with what they are. Naming is the number one most important thing in your game or in your code. Well, it's the number one most important thing. There are other things that are important too, but I'm going to say naming is number one, or at least the number one easy thing to hit. So don't screw it up and don't abbreviate. And since we're talking about naming, let's briefly dive into nouns versus verbs and what our classes and methods should be named. So our classes, in general, almost always should be a noun. They should be an object, a thing, a person, a place, like a rocket launcher, a player, a level, or a mountain, or whatever it is. It should be a noun, a physical thing or a thing that you can visualize in your head as an object. The methods, however, should be verbs. These should be actions or things that we do. So we've got a rocket launcher that's a noun, it's an object, and it fires a rocket straight. That is the method or the verb. And all of our methods should be verbs like this. So we've got fire rocket straight as a verb. We also have a rocket that's a class, and that is a noun. So if you look, we're getting a rocket from get rocket in pool, which is, again, a verb to get the rocket from the pool, and the rocket is going to be the noun or the object. And then we're telling the rocket to launch, another method or verb. So we want to stick with the standard of nouns for classes and verbs for methods. It makes it so it's very easy to understand what our code is doing and how to interact with it and how to work with our code in a very logical way. Now that we've talked about casing and naming, let's talk briefly about what order things should be in. How should your classes be laid out, and what should this look like? I personally think that it's pretty important to keep things standardized and keep things in a consistent order in a way that makes it easy for everybody to understand. So let's go over my preferred order. I like to start with constants up at the top. I, again, don't use them very often, but when I do, I want them to be very spelled out that, hey, there's some constant that this class really cares about, and it's probably special and important and has some special meaning, so you should know about it. Then I go on to static stuff, because I find that these get misused or misunderstood a lot, and it's very easy to get confused when a variable is static, especially if it's mixed in kind of buried in between things. So making sure that static things are very obvious and called out is very important to me. So I like to put these right at the top as well. Next, I'll put in my serialized fields because these are the things that designers are going to customize and edit. And if there are going to be quite a few of them, I like them to be right at the top. Most of the time, I don't have a lot of serialized fields. I'll have one or none, so it's not a big issue. But in the cases where I have a lot of them, I really want them to be very visible and right up at the top. Next, I'll go with public properties because I assume that these are things that other classes are going to be interacting with. So I'll put my public properties there with the Pascal case. And then I follow up with something that I think may be a little bit different, but it's private properties. And that's just because I like to keep all of these properties that could or could not be calculating all in a single area. So my public and private properties, all of these that secretly could hide a little bit of complexity are in the same spot, and I don't have to go digging for them. Next, I'd go with private fields because I think that they're a little bit less important to have visible, but I want to have all of my fields in the same area. All of my properties and fields, public or private, I want all of that data to be right up near the top so that I can figure out all of the data that's in my class. And I don't have to dig through the class to figure out what other data this class knows about. Now, ideally, before I dive into the rest of this, I want to point out that ideally our class should fit on a single screen at a time. So I should be able to see all of my class all at once and understand it and absorb it. That's almost never the case. That's a rare but ideal scenario. Most of the time, though, it should be at least under 100 lines. So if it's starting to get too large and there's too much data in here that I have to litter it around to be able to know where it is, it's better to start thinking about maybe I should split this class up into multiple. Maybe this class is doing too many things and it should be kind of spread apart or refactored or extracted. But let's jump back into order. So after private variables is when I dive into awake. And you can see here that we're all the way down to line 19. To be honest, a lot of the time I don't have this many things up above our awake, and it just starts off with one or two properties or one or two fields and an awake. Then we go into update. Now I also want to point out, with awake, I don't just mean awake. It could be awake, it could be a start method, it could be awake and start, or if it's non-mono behavior, you have just a regular old class, which a lot of your files should be, it could just be the constructor. I think of awake and start as almost constructor replacements, more of awake as a constructor replacement though. So just remember that all three of those could be in there in any scenario. And I would probably go with awake and then start because that's the order that they're called in if you're going to use both. Next, update. So update is called often. It should be right up at the top so that I know that this thing is doing something in an update and I can understand what it is. And I can even just quickly, briefly look and expand it and say, oh, okay, it's just taking damage, 1 damage every frame. I'm sure that sounds like a great gameplay mechanic, right? So let's jump into the next part, which is public methods. So after update, I will put all of my public methods. Some people like to put their public methods up a bit higher so that they can see that they're getting called, but I personally like to think of update as a public method. Even though it's private, it's being called by something external, and the control of that isn't necessarily internal. So I like to just think of it kind of the same. I care about what update is doing just as much as I care about these public methods. And a lot of the time, there's not a lot of mix or not a lot of overlap. If I have an update, there probably aren't many public methods. And if I have a lot of public methods, there probably isn't an update there. Following the public methods is private methods, because these are only cared about by the code in the class. So I shove these down at the bottom, and I want to dive into the last and I think most important part of this ordering, which is keeping them in order that they're called, or I think it was called the newspaper or fold out method, so that as we go through the code and as I read it, the code calling me is always above me. So if I look at set weapon is actually called by die. So I can kind of read this in order. And die, if I expand out take damage, is actually called by take damage. So I can be in here, and let's just zoom in. Say imagine I've got a little bit more code here, and this is a real class or with a lot of stuff going on. I'm reading, I see take damage, I go through, okay, reduces health, and if it gets too low, it goes into die. And then die is right down below it, and okay, that goes into set weapon, okay, and then that goes into here and does some weapon setting. And it's very important to keep these things as easily chained or easily read as possible. You want to be able to just scroll through it, understand what it's doing, and not have to hit the hotkeys to bounce around in your code so much. If you have to keep switching around in code and going back and switching all over the file, you're flipping around, and you get the idea. It gets to be a lot harder to understand what's going on. If you can keep things in this order where they're nice and organized, it makes a big difference. It's also worth noting that sometimes things can't be in order. I may have set weapon calling take damage, or maybe die is calling something else it has to be up above. It's okay if they have to be out of order, but the goal is to try to keep them as in order as possible to make them easy to read and easy to understand. And if they get too wild and too out of order, you may have too big of classes, but still just try to keep them as clean as possible. Now let's talk about some very important rules for properties. And properties should be littered throughout your code, so it's important to get these right and make sure that you standardize on these and you kind of decide what to do. But my rules are, number one, for a public property, I try to default to not having a setter. This doesn't mean that I don't add a setter, but by default, I don't add a setter. I don't say, hey, public float speed get set. I just say public float speed with a getter, and then once I need a setter, I'll add it. And if I do add a setter, the next step is to add a private setter so that it can only be modified by the code in this class. I almost never have a setter that's public with a get and a set. It usually means that I'm breaking some encapsulation rules or that I'm exposing too much, so I try to avoid it. But sometimes I have them, and I live with that. I just want to point that out. It's not a hard rule, but just try to prefer not having those when it makes sense or when you can. Now, the next part is a hard rule, and that is naming your properties to match the class that they came from. This used to confuse me. I used to think like, oh, this is a terrible idea. Now I'm not going to know which one's the member and which one's the class, or you know, which one's the definition, which one's my actual variable. But we have editors now that color all of this stuff and make it very obvious. And I don't think that there's an editor out there that doesn't do that. I also don't find that I've ever gotten really confused and not understood that I was referencing a static method on a class instead of the instance of the class, which is really the only scenario where this could get confusing. If the weapon had like a public static method on it, you could maybe get a little confused, but I would say always prefer to name your variable the same as the class name, because it makes it a lot easier to understand what it is, and you don't have to come up with two names that somehow link together and make sense but aren't exactly the same. So make them match. Next up, prefer expression body properties when possible. So if you have a property that's just a getter that's maybe wrapping something, returning back a property of another thing, like I have a weapon that's returning, or I'm returning back my weapon's attack speed for this attack speed check here on line 13. If you have something like that, go with an expression body property. If it will all fit on there and it's easy to understand and you don't have some weird logic in there, do the expression body property. If you have to add in a bunch of weird ternary operators and make it confusing and hard to understand, then don't do that. But in a case where it's easy, go with that. It makes it simpler to read, easier to understand, just reduces some of that litter and mess. Now I want to talk about the most important part here for properties, even more important than naming them right, which is that your setters for properties should not do things other than validation. They have the ability to do code, run code in there. It's primarily there for validation and event orchestration. If you use it to do weird things like killing your player and persisting them to the database, you will find that somebody's going to misuse it. It might be you in the future. It might be a coworker that goes, hey, I want to set health to this. Oh, I'm just going to set it every frame because it doesn't matter, right? Not realizing that, oh yeah, the setter on this does something stupid and calls out to the database and you're spamming the database and killed the game or whatever it is. This is a very extreme scenario, but it's one that I have seen where calls to a setter were causing database persistence and just killing performance because somebody didn't understand or didn't realize that setting this value was a very costly thing. When it's something costly, something that's going to be a big call like this, don't make it a setter on a variable. It gets confusing. It's very easy to hide it, I should say, and hard to understand what's going on. So never do something in the setter other than validation or sending out an event that the value changed. Don't go beyond that. Don't make it more confusing. Now I'm going through my list and I've got about a dozen other recommendations. So I think what I am going to do is turn all of this into a doc and make it available for you. So if you're watching this and you're interested in this, drop a comment down below just to make sure that I know that you're interested in it, and you probably will see the doc down below too. So just go grab it and you can go through all of my recommendations in writing and maybe use that as a basis to start your own coding doc. Again, I also want to just really point out that you should not go create a coding doc and just send it off to your team and say, hey team, here's our coding doc. Instead, get together with a completely blank doc, pull up some examples and some ideas of the things that you want to use and build that doc together. Come together as a team, put it together, and agree on it as a team. It'll be a whole lot easier to stick to and a whole lot easier to make sure that your code actually follows the doc and it's not just some wasted thing that sits off there that you just give to new people to go check out, follow for a week and ignore. So stick to coding standards, do the right thing, try to make it easier for yourself. It's going to be better for you and your team. You'll probably enjoy the results. And I'm lying. You will definitely enjoy the results if you can get everybody to follow these standards or follow some set of standards and do things right. Now, I wanted to say a special thanks to everybody on Patreon. Really do appreciate you guys. And I also wanted to say, please hit like and subscribe and share the video with everybody. No, anyway, thanks again for everybody for watching. Appreciate it. If you guys have questions or your other own recommendations on coding standards, drop them in the comments below too. I'd be kind of curious to get some more ideas and maybe build this into a very big coding standards doc that everybody can use. All right, thanks again. Bye. I'll shut up now.